Bjornson, is that the way it's pronounced? Yeah? We'll speak on the origins of the common law, or the common law origins of law, that is, one of his pet projects. Kevin has been an activist libertarian for a great many years. As a matter of fact, he was a member of the organization that preceded ISIL that existed for about 1 year, the Association of Rational Individualists, which was created in 1968 and later became SIL, which is basically our organization. And he's been an active in the Libertarian Party and libertarian circles in the United States. And this, as I say, is one of his pet projects, the study of common law. So, Kevin, are you ready to proceed?
You betcha.
Yes.
Yes, I'll be talking on the natural origins of common law. Now, the common law is not exactly up to libertarian standards, but it's leading it heavily in that direction. Now, of course, intellectual ideas rarely exist in a vacuum. That I admit that, or acknowledge, would like to acknowledge, my indebtedness to Frederick Bastiat and Ayn Rand and the Austrian School of Economics. Now, it's my intention here to give a brief overview of natural law, common law, as well as admiralty and other statutory laws. Now, I will be going by my outline here, but most of my comments, or a lot of my comments, will be extemporaneous. So feel free to interject your own questions or comments during the speech. I hope to also save a few minutes at the end where we can have an interchange of ideas. Now, I think that the law can be divided into two broad categories: natural law and positive law. Okay, what is the definition of natural law? That branch of ethics having to do with human justice, which provides an objective standard for evaluating human actions involving force against other humans. Now, this theory's been around for a long time. In fact, the great orator and philosopher Cicero, speaking right after the golden age of Rome, and when it was starting to degenerate into an empire, stated that true law is right reason, conformable to nature, universal, unchangeable, eternal, whose prohibitions restrain us from evil. This law cannot be contradicted by any other law, and is not liable either to derogation or abrogation. Neither the Senate nor the people can give us any dispensation for not obeying this universal law of justice. It needs no other expositor and interpreter than our own conscience. It is not one thing at Rome and another at Athens, one thing today and another tomorrow. But in all times and nations, this universal law must forever reign, eternal and imperishable. This guy was born about 100 years before Christ. Then, of course, with the Caesars came in and corrupted Rome to the point where it became an empire. Now, the other type of, let's pause here, and let's assume that there is no natural law. Well, then what we are left with is very insubstantial grounds for challenging any type of government. The opposite theory is the consequentialist or utilitarian theory. Now, the Austrian critique of this is that all values are subjective, and therefore we have no way of defining what the greatest good is. But even if we accept that there are objective values or objective goods, and let's say we define this as gross national product, for example, we have a tremendous problem of measurement, scientific measurement, and proving that in each individual instance, this particular government action resulted in a certain amount of growth. For instance, you can say that there is a good economy, but in tracing cause and effect, it becomes very, very difficult. I think it's much better that if we follow the rules of common law as a body, then of course the economy will prosper and people will be happy. Now the opposite type of law is positive law. Now what I mean by that is not positive in the sense of good. If I may make an analogy to logical positivism, that's the school of thought which says that there's no really objective standards of reality, that all we can do is talk about language. And A.J. Ayer was one of the big expositories of that. So in a similar vein, legal positivism maintains that there is no objective standard that applies to government statutes or decisions. Now, typically when we think of government, we're thinking of, nowadays in the 20th century, we're thinking of statutes because that's how most things are done. And admiralty law is one type of statute. Now what admiralty law is, it's the law of the sea. And the opposite type is the law of the land. Now common law has been called the law of the land because during the medieval ages that most of the government decisions had to do with ownership of land. And prior to that, for instance, the Hadrian the Roman Emperor stated that Rome is where the Roman army is. They had no real concept of land sovereignty as such. Also the common law had to do with the rights of people when they were on the land, and so this is why it's called the law of the land. Now I'll get more into admiralty law later on. Common law is a hybrid. It has natural origins in the sense that it grew out of custom. It also is natural in the sense that there are rational principles that have been used to change it. This gets us into equity law. But basically, it's expressed often through judicial decisions, either which came to be written. They weren't always written down, though. And in the past, it started out as just verbal. Actually, these things started out as customs. And so in that sense, it can be said to be natural because it involved a spontaneous order of various societies. Hogue, in his Origins of the Common Law, defines it as English common law as a body of general rules prescribing social conduct enforced by the ordinary royal courts and characterized by the development of its own principles and actual legal controversies, by the procedure of trial by jury and the doctrine of the supremacy of law. Now, there's another good book in this area by Sir Henry Sumner Maine, published originally in England in 1861, called Ancient Law. Now, he considers more in terms of the Roman law, which English borrowed considerably from. Now, back then, it was called the Law of the Nations, which is not to be confused with international law. But the Law of the Nations, back then, the only nations that they were familiar, this is like in the early days of the Roman Republic, there were several Roman nations or jurisdictions, and what was in common with all of them was called the common law. Now the reason this came about is not through some abstract philosophy of let's have something in common, but foreigners who were often wealthy and were trading with the Italians would often want to use the law system for lawsuits regarding property or whatever. And of course, they did not want to use the legal systems of the foreigners where they came from, nor could they use whatever law was happened to be in that particular jurisdiction. So they extracted from all the Roman jurisdictions the common characteristics. So I think in a sense this is scientific. It's like an experiment. If you put, I would say that virtually every society, every human society, certain common things are illegal. Private murder, private theft, rape, etc. No matter what society, they all have these things in common. Not just Roman societies, but I would say this is worldwide. The big exception comes about if you're a government official, then somehow it's okay to do that. So now, I do have an academic knowledge of these topics. I'm also speaking from experience. I am a victim of the application of admiralty law, as well as the criminal statutes regarding marijuana. And these all contradict natural law and common law. If I may explain how this came about. Now, I'm the owner of Hydrotech since 1981. I manufacture and retail lighting fixtures for indoor plant growth. Now, this is quite common in Europe, Northern Europe, where the climate is not good for outdoor growing. People are using high-pressure sodium lights in greenhouses. The United States is, a lot of the people who use these lights are growing marijuana, or actually cannabis sativa, or the English call it hemp. Now, I also sell hydroponic supplies. Now, what's happening here with me is that my inventory, now you talk about Hornberger saying it's right to trial by jury. Well, not always. Doesn't always happen that way. October 26th at 10 a.m. in the morning, I was awoken by a federal marshal. And the marshals and the DEA officials were there, it was about a dozen of them, held me prisoner while they hauled away all the inventory of my store. Now, this is prior to any hearing in which I knew anything about. I was given no prior notice of this, no chance to contest it. The first thing I heard about it was when they were right there, hauling everything away. They had a couple of big trucks. All my inventory was wiped out, what they could haul away. The bank account was frozen. My trucks were almost seized, but they made a mistake in the paperwork and forgot to include them. They were included in I had two stores, one in Oregon. They were included there, but the trucks happened to be in Seattle at the time. For some reason, the house was not seized. I think because the owner of the house that I was buying it from was a little old lady, quite wealthy, and they didn't want to upset her. She was politically, I guess, sacrosanct. So I was able to sell the house before they could put any liens on it. I guess because this was a part of a nationwide operation, they were obviously busy, government bureaucrats being incompetent. It's kind of like the Dunkirk, where the Hitler was overconfident, didn't want to use his panzers and let the British escape, and instead of wiping them out. Well, they didn't quite finish the job. I was able to restart my business by selling my house, and I reinvested the money in inventory and built it back up again. But of course, I was deprived of due process. Now, almost 3 years later, I was charged criminally with conspiracy to grow marijuana and money laundering. And the money laundering was the most serious charge, carrying 20 years, and it arose from the fact that some of my customers were growing marijuana, and they paid me money to buy the equipment. So me receiving the money from the customers, in their interpretation, is laundering money. So, and the only proof that they had that I even knew was for marijuana, I had them sign a statement saying it wasn't for marijuana, but I did smoke a joint with them. So this was the only proof that I knew it was for marijuana. There's a lot of people who are smoking who are not necessarily growing. Now, what happened was they bought $50,000 worth of equipment and shipped it off to Arizona. The person who received the equipment was freaked out and never actually grew anything with it, but we still conspired to do it. And because of the large number of equipment, they calculated 5,000 plants, and they multiplied 5,000 times this grid formula, and it comes out to be quite a number of years if I were found guilty. Now, I was set up with about 18 counts, and the problem with going to trial over that, number one, they'd seized all my inventory, so I had no money to pay for attorneys. Number two, because of the large number of counts, if I were found guilty of even one of them, it would have the same effect as if I'd been found guilty of all of them, because the standard of proof for sentencing is less than the standard of proof for conviction. So if the judge thinks there's probable cause to believe I was guilty, even though the jury found me not guilty, they could sentence me as if I had been found guilty. So in effect, this deprives me of the right to trial by jury, or the trial becomes a sham. They say, well, you can have your trial afterwards. And of course, after this thing is all over with, after we seize your inventory, then you can have your trial. But if you try to get your inventory back, then you have to waive your Fifth Amendment rights, because you have to testify at the civil trial. And if you don't testify, you lose automatically. So anything they gain through the civil procedure, they can use against me, they could have used against me later criminally. Now, because of the mess up in their paperwork, I had a very good case to get the inventory back because of the delay. So I filed a motion called a Latches motion, which had to pay several $1,000s. I've spent approximately $250,000 to attorneys, by the way, over the years. We filed a motion to return the inventory, which had a very good chance of succeeding. The next day, I was charged criminally. Now, what this does, it has the effect of putting the civil case on hold until after the criminal trial. That's what the judge said. Well, we'll deal with this after your trial. Well, I needed the money before the trial to pay for the attorneys. And because of the risk of being found guilty of even one charge, what will happen a lot of times, the juries will not realize this. They will not realize the rules of sentencing. And they will find you guilty of one charge, figuring that they're going easy on you. Then once the judge gets a hold of it, he sentences you as if you've been found guilty of all the charges. And you can't tell the jury this in trial. And if I had I pled guilty to about half the counts in order to get a deal whereby I would be eligible for probation. I'm still awaiting sentencing. If I hadn't taken the deal, they would have kept me in jail until my trial. I almost certainly would have been found guilty of at least one of the charges, and in all likelihood it would have wound up serving 18 years in prison, federal prison. By the way, the drug war is so epidemic in the United States that they're building one prison per month, and it's barely keeping pace with the new influx of prisoners. By the way, in a sidebar in this IRS thing, I haven't filed since '79. The reason that they were not going after me in the IRS thing is I had a low standard of living and incomplete paperwork, and I wasn't filing. And you can only get away with that if you're self-employed. If you're an employee, you have to file because the employer will do it for you. If you don't, it's called a W-2. So that's the best way. If you don't want to file an income tax, become self-employed and live like a monk or a pauper in any event. Okay, now a little background on this war on drugs. Originally, most of the drugs were imported in the United States, even marijuana, which is bulky, or cannabis sativa, I should say. Then the President Nixon, about 1970, started stepping up the border searches. And as a consequence of that, many people grew the cannabis outdoors in the United States. Well, then with the aerial surveillance, a lot of people moved indoors. So they bought artificial lights and grew indoors. Now, a lot of people grow vegetables, herbs, and flowers indoors as well. But somehow it's supposed to be, government says it's my responsibility to screen out those customers. Somehow, through ESP or whatever, I'm supposed to sell it only to people that are growing herbs, or legal herbs and vegetables. However, the lights don't discriminate. There is no, they will grow anything you put underneath them. Now, this seizure was justified by the Admiralty laws. Now, what is the Admiralty law? It's the law of the high seas, and it was got its biggest application in warfare. What would happen is England would be, for instance, England would be at war with Spain, and they would want to seize all the shipping that was going to Spain. And not having enough ships of war, they would commission privateers like Sir Francis Drake to seize goods on the high seas. So it was mainly used for warfare. It was also used for salvage of sunken ships. And because of this, they had something called in rem proceedings. That means that that the inventory ship or whatever it is could be considered in default because the owner was either in a different country at which they were at war and couldn't be brought to the proceedings, or the owner was not known because the ship was sunk. Now, it's an action against the property, not against the owner of the property. And it goes back historically to the duodend of the medieval days, where, for instance, if a cart were to accidentally go down a hill and kill somebody, it would be forfeited to the king. Now, later on, the British Crown tried to expand that type of forfeiture, and in a 1673 decision, the High Court of England limited this type of application. Now, this limitation was upheld in the United States until about 1871, in which in rem admiralty forfeiture decisions were okayed if there was a war. This was in reference to the Civil War. Now, you might think it's strange they're applying admiralty law on the land, but what happened was originally canals, admiralty law applied to canals. Then when roads were built, roads were considered like canals, and then it just kind of gradually expanded to the point where the law of the seas is now being used on the land. It was expanded during the prohibition of alcohol, but you could not seize the entire estate, only the still or that portion of the estate which was used in the manufacture of illegal marijuana or illegal alcohol. Nowadays, if they find one cannabis seed on a boat, for example, the entire boat can be seized. And in fact, one time they even seized, DEA seized a U.S. government research vessel. And they had to return it because the government, of course, one hand stealing from the other hand, there was no net gain to the government, so they let it go. Well, what is this now? Common law. There were other prohibitions in the common law. The Magna Carta, Article 39, prohibited the seizure of a person's means of making a living. A farmer could not have his plow stolen, and a merchant could not have his merchandise seized. There was also something called in 1166, an assize of novel to scene. If, for instance, somebody seized your land and you sued to return it, your land was returned to you pending the result of the trial. Also, Hogue was pointing out that there was a criminal seizure, but only after conviction. So there were these traditional limitations which were eroded gradually in the United States in particular. Now, the ancient law, there was very little statutes as we know them today. There were fines for criminal, what we now call criminal violations. There were simply fines. And what would happen is two parties would have a dispute, and the government would be a referee. So it isn't a case of the government versus a person. It's two people arguing and the government settling it. There were, in some cases, legislatures, what we would call legislatures, but they didn't enact statutes with very rare exceptions. For instance, the ancient Scandinavians had something called the folkmoot, which was the village would elect somebody to go to the assembly of 100 villages and so on out the line to the point where they elected the king. So the legislature was seen as a way of electing the king, and the reason that it was done this way as opposed to direct election is that in those days they didn't have adequate communications, and they didn't know who this distant person was, so they had to elect local people that they were familiar with. So what is natural law? Well, Blackstone, who was a famous jurist, pointed out that the earth and all things therein are the general property of mankind from the immediate gift of the Creator. By the law of nature and reason, he who first began to use it acquired them, and in them a kind of transient property that lasted so long as he was using it. When mankind increased in numbers, it became necessary to entertain conceptions of more permanent domain. Now this is a flawed but useful analogy or point. that with the development of agriculture, it became necessary to define property in a more permanent sense. Now, Sir Henry Sumner Maine, being of the 19th century, was very into evolution and was against the notion that anything good can come from the past. Everything is getting better and better every day in every way. And he's saying that there was no state of nature. Well, I acknowledge the state of nature as painted by Rousseau and Locke and Blackstone was simplified. But the point is, not that there was necessarily a Garden of Eden or an ideal state to which we were trying to return, but that if we go back far enough, we find that there was no government. Well, but people still had rights. So it's a way of proving that rights exist independently and preceded government. And the purpose of government originally was to protect those rights. Now, if we even if we accept the evolutionary hypothesis and say that, well, as interpreted by Maine, and say, well, there was no state of nature, that there was maybe even the war of all against all, as Hobbes stated, I still think we have a second ground for believing in natural law. That there's something called the law of equity, and this comes from the Greeks, and we'll talk more about that later. Now, the next step after the state of nature begins to the tribal chiefs, and this evolved into, or clan chiefs, and this evolved into a chief of the whole tribe, which began to be known as kings. This was the so-called heroic age. And what would happen was the Greeks had something called the Themis, and this later evolved into the concept of the goddess of justice. And there was something called themistes. And there was judgments that just existed out there, and then the person making the judgments just pulled them in from the spiritual dimension and rendered these judgments to people coming before him. And it was considered a divine inspiration. There was no statutes as such. The only statutes were, in Rome, for instance, the ancient Rome, the only statutes were if an individual committed a crime against the state. Oh, and by the way, the state of nature is not a state in the sense of government, it's a condition of nature, I might say. Okay, now the Homer says that these judgments came first, and then customs developed out of them. However, these judgments did not exist in a vacuum, that there was a vast oral tradition. The Bible, for instance, originally came from oral tradition. A lot of the Homer's epics were originally oral, involving right brain activity. You know, people would chant songs and poems around the campfire, and it was passed on. Stories and legends were passed on like this. So I think we have to say that the custom preceded the judgments, and the judgments were simply confirming the customs, even though there was some innovation. The next step is that a lot of times the king might be weak or senile or something, and what you had is an aristocracy of knowledge that kind of took the place of the king. This was at a stage when the laws were still unwritten. And most people didn't know what all the laws were because they couldn't travel. And so the people who could do that oftentimes became judges. Later case law was written down. Eventually, it was codified. For instance, the original Constitution of Rome was called the Law of 12 Tables. And it was actually 12 brass plates upon which the rights of people were written down. These do not exist anymore. It's speculated that in one of the sackings of Rome they were stolen, or perhaps one of the first emperors of Rome destroyed them. But it was the Constitution of Rome, and it was based on custom or spontaneous order. Now, Rome degenerated into an empire, and then it fell, and then we had the feudalism, which is a transition to the modern era. The modern era being, of course, classical liberalism, the Declaration of Independence, which says these rights are from nature, and nature's God, the Bill of Rights, which was to affirm the rights of the individuals, which was how the Federalists got the Constitution approved, by promising a Bill of Rights. Now, if this common law is based on custom, and how does progress occur? Well, there's the law of equity, which was based on right reason, symmetry, simplicity, equality. This is where we get the idea of the French and Americans of all men are created equal. Equal in the sense of they have equal rights because we're all humans. You also had the case of just simply the conscience of the judge, or in England, the king's conscience, whatever. In Rome, this theory of equity came from the Greeks, and it was applied to these customary laws in order to simplify them. Now, John Locke and later theorists borrowed from these ideas considerably. The 20th century, what we have is a reversion back to the empire. America is now an empire. Things are done by executive order, bureaucratic regulations. For instance, the IRS can simply put out a regulation. There's a specific statute which says that every IRS regulation has the force of a statute. So basically, we're back to the government by fiat, whether it be bureaucrats or executives or whatever. And this is being used more and more in the war on drugs, and is being used to bludgeon the individual rights. So, if you have any questions or comments, you may certainly start in on it. Yes, sir.
Specifically with respect to property rights, and especially with respect to land, I'd like to humbly suggest that the work of libertarians around the world has not yet been completed. I believe that the perspective we have on property rights is that, for example, such theorists as you cited have done all our work for us. I think what we're discovering recently, for example, is that some primitive societies may actually have had more sophisticated notions of property rights than we have, and certainly than we would give them credit for. And especially in the case of, for example, homesteading, I think our approach to property rights is inadequate, for example, in that it doesn't allow a person to derive property from retaining the land in its pristine state, which may be precisely its most valuable use. So I think we still have some more work to do.
Oh yeah, in fact the Homestead Act was really derived from the Blackstone's conception of mixing your person's labor with unowned land. This goes back to the state of nature theories, where you're in a state of nature, the land is not claimed, you mix your labor with it and you acquire rights to it. Oh yeah, that's definitely still going on, or it should be anyway. Yeah, go ahead.
I wonder if you can make a comment about the fact that alcohol prohibition was passed by constitutional amendment, and yet drug prohibition seems to be an osmotic and insidious thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a very good point. I'm not as familiar with the original prescription against heroin and cocaine in around 1910 or 11. But in the case of marijuana, the first Anti-Cannabis Act was passed in 1937, and it was a tax act, so that it was upheld as being constitutional because it was not prohibiting the cannabis, it was simply, so-called simply, taxing it. Well, subsequent to that, there has been no serious challenge to the cannabis laws that have been able to make their way in the court system. There's an unwritten rule in the federal courts that is the government always wins, and the people who try to challenge it have been squashed. And it is unconstitutional, there's no question about it. I think that the people who are enforcing these laws, the drug enforcement agents, the Supreme Court justices, and the executives, are in violation of the Constitution, they're in violation of natural law, and should be held accountable as individuals. And of course, if that were to happen, there wouldn't be enough lampposts in Washington, D.C. to take care of all of them. Go ahead.
I think as citizens, certainly not as libertarians, but as citizens, people get confused about drug enforcement thinking it affects someone else. and it doesn't. It affects all of us. The example is my brother-in-law, who owned a very large boat that he kept at Puget Sound. His neighbor's boat was seized after a raid, and one marijuana cigarette was found in the pocket of a crewman's jacket. So, you know, an innocent owner lost his boat. My brother-in-law realized that that kind of liability was not worth the investment that he had in the boat, and he sold the boat. I wonder how many other potential boat owners, and I know it's certainly affected aircraft, small aircraft, have made the decision not to purchase equipment like that because they have no recourse.
Exactly.
So it does affect the people who make boats, the people who make airplanes. It's spreading out all over the country, and its effects are really insidious.
Yeah, and they're attempting to, the government is so incompetent, they're trying to force the business owners, the property owners, into a position of doing their dirty work for them. I mean, the businessman already is collecting taxes and isn't paid for it, and he has to do it. It's called withholding. Now, we're also expected to be social workers, and now we have to be responsible for the end use of the product that we're selling and the use of the property that we may own. In fact, somebody just read in the paper on the way out, flying out here, that this fellow was from Saudi Arabia and was married to an American woman, had kids and everything, and was in America to buy a truck, and he had to drive to Houston with cash because he wanted a special customized truck. And he wanted to bring cash because he wasn't sure they would take an out-of-state check. So he brings $12,000, was pulled over for speeding, and then his money was seized, saying it was for drug money. Okay, well then once they seize it, then you have the burden of proof shifts. Then you have to prove that you're innocent. Well, how do you prove a negative? How do you prove it wasn't for drugs? And see, all they have to do is say that there was probable cause to seize it, or even if there wasn't probable cause, that in reality, but if they had reason to believe there was probable cause, they can seize it, and then the burden of proof then shifts. There have been numerous examples of people, Mexican American, bringing cash to buy nursery plants for his business, and most of the small nursery growers use cash. And his money was seized, and he's having trouble now. And you wind up spending more in attorney fees than what it's worth. I've spent a lot of money on attorneys, and it really, there's no way you can come on ahead of that, and you don't get that money back usually. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, as an extension of this same use of illegitimate authority, I recently participated in a massive rally in Santa Fe, New Mexico, by the holistic and alternative medicine people.
Yeah.
You may be familiar with the case of this Washington physician who's,
I know him.
Whose clinic was raided. He just happened to be a libertarian. That may or may not have had something to do with it. But at gunpoint, they broke down his doors, and they terrorized his 21-person staff and his patients, and confiscated all of his vitamins and herbs and medicine and his records and his computers.
Right.
And to this day, none of that has been returned, and he has not been really charged with anything, to my knowledge.
Right. Right. The history of that case is that that L-tryptophan is a natural product. It's found in milk, and it has therapeutic or nutritional uses. It also has a mild stimulating effect or a euphoric effect if you take it straight. Now, if it's refined, it can also be used as a mind-altering substance if you know how to refine it, which is very few people do. But there was one batch in Japan that was contaminated, and they made the DEA made the whole thing illegal, L-tryptophan. And they seized his inventory of L-tryptophan a couple of years ago, even though it had been certified by the Mayo Clinic as being free of this contaminant. And, for instance, he does a lot of injectable vitamins. Well, the vitamin B, as made in the United States, has artificial preservatives in it, so it's not really safe to inject it. So he had to buy some from West Germany, and they said he was smuggling the vitamin B in because it did not have an English label on it. Well, you know, if the U.S. government can't afford to hire some German-speaking people, they shouldn't be going around seizing their inventory. Then what happens, they seize everything, and then you're deprived of your means of making a living, or you're crippled, and that means you have less money to pay attorneys, you're less able to fight it, and most people just cave in. Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
Just a quick comment. As far as, you reminded me that people aren't charged with this. The Pittsburgh Press did a study and found that 80% of the people who had seizures were never charged with a crime.
Yeah, it's a way of getting money. It goes back to the old piracy era, where you just take somebody's property. Now, it should be remembered that cannabis sativa was routinely prescribed in the 19th century and the early 20th century for menstrual cramps, for headaches, et cetera, et cetera. And you can imagine what would happen to the sales of aspirin and other pharmaceutical products. Now, the other thing is it has industrial uses. For instance, the original Levi's were made with hemp, which is the fiber of the plant. And of course, hemp is much stronger than cotton. And the original Levi's, where they show the two donkeys pulling it apart, well, you did that with cotton, it would just rip. And it's just amazing how just as hemp was about to become more commercially viable with new processing machinery, and about the same time that DuPont came out with artificial rayon and synthetic fibers. It's just amazing how, yeah, the prohibition of alcohol ends, we have a bunch of unemployed bureaucrats. Hemp was starting to come into its own at the same time that these artificial fibers were coming about. And Hearst, the newspaper chain, had vast timber holdings, which would be devalued considerably if hemp became more commercially valuable. Then all of a sudden we had this reefer madness scare, which resulted in the 1937 passing of the Tax Act. Well, and then we had a brief respite in World War II, where it was the government Department of Agriculture encouraged its growth for cordage and ropes. And then after the 50s, it kind of died, everybody kind of forgot about it, except for a few jazz musicians. And then when middle-class kids started smoking marijuana in the 60s, there was just a big hysteria. And, you know, many of these anti-drug commercials that you see on billboards and television in the United States are funded by the alcohol and tobacco companies. And you can just imagine their motive. Yeah.
Well, I think maybe our only hope is the absurdity to which these drug enforcement officers take this. In southeastern Idaho, there was a local drug officer whose department salary and expenses depended upon the receipts of seizure properties that had been seized. And he was running out of money, so he had 27 indictments before a county judge to refurnish his department budget, and the judge realized that that was the reason none of these indictments had any clear justification, and he not only refused to hear the indictments, but you know, used what influence he had to make sure that this drug enforcement officer was fired. So, I mean, they become so blatant about their activity that the seizure of property is really for their own personal benefit.
Yeah, the judges are beginning to, most of them are you know, appointed, not elected, but still, even the judges are becoming upset with this, but there's not much they can do about it because they want to get promoted, and of course the executive branch does the promotions. And those are the exceptions when they start limiting it. The rule is that they just do more and more, and it's just getting quite crazy. Yeah, Mary?
Just another quick comment. It's not only in the drug area. There was a lady who was thought to have stolen $500 of UPS packages, and they seized her home and her cars, and she's now started an organization in the United States called FEAR to try to you know, get this stuff stopped. So it's not even in drug enforcement anymore. It's basically anything.
Yeah, and the reason the police are not that interested in going after, I think all the drugs should be legal because the problems of hard drugs are mostly associated with the illegality, the price being higher, necessitating theft, and disputes over drug deals, etc. But even so, I mean, I think it's kind of interesting to note that the police are not as likely to go after a crack dealer because he usually does not own a house, and has no real property. They like to go after cannabis growers because the people are growing in their houses typically that they may own. Those houses can be seized. You can be thrown out of you can be homeless, become homeless because you want to grow your own pot. Yeah.
Another comment on that. I own some property in the poor side of town that I had gotten back on land contract, and we were trying to clean it up. We had drug dealers making deals in the yard, and of course they were also destroying the property. So we called the police and told them about this, hoping they'd at least remove them. They said, no, we can't do that because any one of your tenants could claim they invited them there and we couldn't do anything, so we're not going to bother. So what you're saying about how they go after people with money is definitely true.
Yeah. Now, there's something called Weed and Seed program, which is a pilot program in Seattle where they're trying to federalize the street-level dealing of these crack. And what happens is they have something called drug-free zones, where it's within a certain number of distant feet of a school or a playground that the fines and penalties are all doubled. Well, in the central city, because of the density of the buildings, most of the areas in a central city are in drug-free zones. So what happens is when you federalize these crimes, you have an enormous number of poor, typically black street dealers who do not have the money to pay for attorneys, and they're just rounded up in these massive raids, and it's going to start filling up the prisons at a much faster rate. And what happens is when the prisons are at capacity, and these are very expensive, it costs about $30,000 a year to maintain somebody in a prison. They're talking about military camps. Well, military camps, abandoned military bases are not secure facilities. And they start jacking the penalties up. For instance, I know a person who let a friend of his use his phone, and the guy used the phone to make a drug deal for cocaine. They both happened to be Colombians. He got 21 years for conspiracy. Another instance where somebody driving a car and somebody's doing a drug deal in the back seat in a different language that he can't even understand, but because he was said to be facilitating the deal because he was driving around in the car, that he got charged. If you just see some activity or attempted drug sales going on, you're supposed to report them. What's going to happen is the prisons are going to get full up, and more people are going to escape from them. Right now in the city of Portland, the federal district of Portland, the people, because they have like a zero tolerance policy there, because Oregon was considered a risky state. They were going liberal on pot in the early 70s. The feds were afraid that it would drift in a liberal direction, so they became a targeted state. They put in U.S. attorneys there who had zero tolerance, so more people were charged with smaller amounts federally. The federal penalties are much stiffer, and the resources the federal government has are just enormous. They have unlimited staff, unlimited budget. They just go in there and they just run you over. Well, what happens is that typically now, of the people who are charged with a federal drug crime, only half of them are released prior to trial. And of those who are released, only half show up for further proceedings. So this is really overloading the U.S. Marshal's Office, and typically they're less able now to go after bank robbers and kidnappers because most of the federal offenses now, about 80% of them are drug related. Usually a sale of drugs. And so this it's already overloading the system. If the laws are not changed, the U.S. government will fall. It will collapse. And I don't know what's going to take the place of it, but I think that they will have to change the laws. And of course, by experience, we know that these things don't work, and so this gets us back to the natural law theory. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to share something I did for a few years that I would recommend to others if you have the stomach for it. I got a job several years ago for the Salt Lake City Police Department as a dispatcher. And in that position, I took incoming calls from people who wanted to report drug dealers, prostitutes, various other victimless crimes, and I would take the information and throw it away. And that's just inefficient bureaucracy. What can I say? I mean, you know,
and any computer programmers out there, when I worked for the IRS, you could do quite a nice job there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Salt Lake City's a city of 500,000, and there is real crime there, and so I would always just throw it away, and I did this for over 4 years without getting caught. They finally got me on a drunk driver report. Some girl called from a convenience store saying, there's a man in here who's really drunk, he's going to get in his car and leave, and I thought, well, you know, I figure if he's so drunk he gets in a wreck, we'll catch him, and if he's you know, makes it home, okay, then it's a victimless crime. So I just let that one slide too, and a policeman finally came to the convenience store an hour later to buy some coffee, and she says, well, it took you long enough to get here, and the man just left and all this kind of stuff, and he said, what are you talking about? And so they checked into it, and they went back and listened to the tapes of the phone conversation. I said, well, gee, I must have hit the wrong button on the computer and erased it, so I didn't get in any trouble, really. They just said, well, watch it, you know. And,
yeah, well, of course, once the roads are privatized, the private owners would be able to establish their own regulations through a contractual relationship with the users of the road. Mm-hmm. And I certainly, of course, there would be different roads then too, high-risk roads and low-risk roads. And I think that it certainly is a serious thing to endanger life and property under the influence of any substances.
Now, I wanted to ask also, do you have any comments about mandatory sentencing?
Yeah, that's the other thing. The federal judges are very upset about this because they have very little downward discretion. They have upward discretion. They can increase the sentence beyond the guidelines, but it's very difficult for them to go below the guidelines. And the guidelines are a very complicated formula involving the number of plants, the weight of the product you're selling, prior convictions, and there's a whole range of variables that goes into a grid, and it changes virtually every year. Usually it gets worse. Although most of these really bad laws were passed in the 80s, and we're kind of reached a plateau now where they're simply trying to enforce the existing laws, which are already really bad. What happens is that if you have a bunch of small plants, let's say your rooted cuttings, you may have 100 of them. Well, each plant is considered to be 2 pounds no matter what size it is, and that translates into an X number of months. In my case, with the 18 counts that I was hit up with, I could have served a maximum of 234 years. Now, my plea bargain, I've got it down to a maximum of 113 years. So I think that's a big improvement. Of course, in my particular case, the plea bargain that I had was was allowed for probation, but in most cases that does not happen. It's a mandatory minimum, and they have to do the time. And there's just knowledge of this is just now hitting the streets, and people are becoming more and more aware of it, and they're simply going on the lam. They're simply, like me, for instance. It's very unusual for a convicted felon like myself to be allowed out of the United States. I had to get a federal judge to sign a minute order, and through a lot of, I had to pull a lot of strings, believe me, and it involved massaging the prosecutor. I happened to have caught him in a number of procedural violations, so it was kind of kind of twisted his arm a little bit, and through a lot of attorney money, I was able to get permission to leave the country, but I'm the exception. Most people I get shafted if they're poor or black or whatever. And I'm being shafted bad enough. I mean, you know. So. Okay, enjoy.